9, you are muted. If you have questions, please ask those in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat, and then at the end, we'll also be able to unmute and ask questions as well that way. But please enter those questions in the chat box, and we'll make sure that they get to Dr. Charlton. So thank you all for attending. This is the first in a 5-part series on the issue that's really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds in agriculture, and that is where to find good employees and how to train and develop those good employees. So these are the next, let's see if I can get it to advance. There we go. Yeah, this is the first one in the series. We'll continue it in December 6th with developing a ranch internship program. January 10th with structured internship programs for ranches. And then February 7th with a new program that we have that's designed to increase veterans entering into the ranching industry as viable employees. And then on March 7th, we'll have Dan Leahy, the Director of Foundation for Ranch Management, who will be on campus and virtually talking about to students and to those out in the industry, saying, do you have what it takes to be a professional ranch manager? All the seminars will be recorded, and you can find them if you are unable to make them in person at the web address for the Dan Scott Ranch Management Program at MSU. So with that, today I'd like to welcome our first speaker, and it's Dr. Diane Charlton. Diane is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics at Montana State University. Her research interests are at the intersection of labor markets and labor migration, agricultural production, and development economics. She holds a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from UC Davis, and she'll be talking to us today about agricultural labor, immigration, and innovation. So welcome, Diane. Just change slideshows here quickly.
Perfect. Thank you. Great, thank you, and thanks for having me. It looks like an exciting lineup here, so that would be wonderful. So I just want to start off just looking at the bigger picture of the workforce in the United States. So if we go back to 1900, 40% of the US population lived on farms and 60% in rural areas. Today, just 1% live on farms and 14% in rural areas. So an entirely different picture than there was in 1900. So given this very large change in the past 100 plus years, how has labor-intensive agricultural production continued? And how does the labor force surround agriculture in general, even from some of those less labor-intensive crops or livestock that still depends on a rural workforce? And so the solution has been immigration. And the United States is not alone in bringing in immigrants to work on farms. More developed countries around the globe tend to bring in immigrants to do farm work. New Zealand brings in guest workers from Pacific Island nations, Canada from the Caribbean and Mexico, Spain from Morocco, Latin America, Romania and others, UK from Poland and other Eastern European countries, South Africa from Zimbabwe. In the United States, more than 3/4 of the US crop workforce is foreign born. So I'm looking at the crop workforce because we have a National Agricultural Workers Survey that is nationally representative of the crop workforce. We don't have the same kind of data for livestock, but it still gives us some picture of what agricultural workforce in the United States looks like. So this is crop workers excluding H-2A guest workers. H-2A constitutes roughly 10% of the full-time equivalent crop workforce. Less than 26% of the crop workforce is actually born in the United States. The vast majority come from Mexico. So I'm going to take us back and look at a little bit of the history of immigration and agricultural work. So starting with the Bracero program, many of you might have heard of the Bracero program. There were actually two programs. The first one was a guest worker agreement between the United States and Mexico from 1917 to 1921. Mexicans migrated into the United States for the growing or harvesting seasons and afterwards returned to Mexico. And Mexico did not initially renew this program. They entered the program thinking that workers would bring back remittances and that it would be beneficial. Hide that. Beneficial for Mexico in that respect, but in reality, workers weren't able to bring back much savings, so they didn't renew the program. But during World War II, the United States, a lot of the workers were overseas, and so they started a second Bracero program, and that extended past World War II until 1964. And even during the peak years of the Bracero program, illegal immigration was escalating. So for various reasons, it might have been easier to immigrate without getting a Bracero permit or visa. Some workers might have been able to migrate at lower cost than with the Bracero program. Even today, you might know growers who have used the Bracero program. When I travel to Mexico, occasionally I run into people who like Are we working now? Okay, great. So rural Mexico, poor access to education, few alternatives outside of agricultural work, and U.S. farm wages, while lower than wages in other U.S. industries, were often 10 times greater than they would be in rural Mexico. So migrating to the United States to work in agriculture could have been a good option. And just some evidence of how the Bracero program impacted these migration networks. So the blue dots here are the number of Braceros who came to the United States each year. The gray dots are those who immigrated with other legal visas. And then the orange dots are apprehensions. Now, apprehensions obviously is an imperfect measure of unauthorized immigration, but you do have to have unauthorized immigrants coming to the United States to actually have the apprehensions. So, you know, Border Patrol also would be a factor in the number of apprehensions, but it is some clue into how these migration networks were growing and unauthorized immigration growing throughout that period. So there's a nearly 2,000-mile border between Mexico and the United States. And by the late 1980s, over half of California farm workers were unauthorized. 70 to 80% succeeded in crossing the border on their first attempt. And in the early 1980s, almost a quarter of the California farm workforce were unauthorized. In 2001 to 2002, according to the NAS, 16% of the U.S. hired farm workforce were new migrants, and 99% of new migrants to agriculture were unauthorized. Today, it's estimated that a little less than half of the crop workforce is unauthorized, and that's according to the NAS. The Bracero program ended abruptly. In 1964, there was a car accident that involved several workers who were coming back from the fields. Tragic incident. Suddenly, everyone's focus was on the Bracero program and the potentially unsafe working conditions, transportation, and other living conditions. So Congress ended the Bracero program in 1964, and farmers were concerned about a labor shortage. Those labor shortages were never realized. There were a few reasons for that. So one of the reasons was this unauthorized immigrant network that we've been talking about. And another major, and also there were labor associations that came about that helped connect workers to farms. But another major reason was adoption of new technologies that reduced the dependence on labor. So one of the most famous of these was the tomato harvester. And this was a joint innovation between plant scientist Jack Hanna and engineer Kobe Lorenzen. And I think this is one of the, it's a famous example for a few reasons. I think one of the reasons is because it really demonstrates the interdisciplinary work that's required to come up with good innovations in agriculture. Within 3 years, California's acreage in mechanically harvested tomatoes rose from 3% to 90%. So it was widely adopted very rapidly. It saved an estimated nearly 20 million man hours per year. And this is just an old photo that UC Davis has of this tomato harvester in its early stages. But the other reason that this innovation is so famous is because of the lawsuit that followed. So worker advocates sued the University of California for using government grant dollars that were beneficial to some, but not all. And in particular, they argued that this research benefited agribusiness at the expense of small growers, farm workers, and consumers who had fewer options. And the University of California lost this lawsuit. It's worth millions of dollars. So you can imagine how this affected innovation and the incentives to do research and development in the following years. And so even now, even though we're many decades past this, even now, we're coming off of this era where people are very reticent to invest in labor-saving technologies in agriculture. A paper in 1970 tried to quantify the costs and benefits of this innovation. They found net positive returns, so social benefits, from the tomato harvester. But in economics, we would say that this isn't Pareto efficient, because for something to be Pareto efficient, we say that someone has to be made better off and no one can be made worse off. The tomato harvester clearly made some people better off, many people worse off. If you had to find a new job, if you're a small grower who can't compete, can't adopt one of these harvesters, can't compete, put some people out of work. So this is sort of the history of technological development and labor in agriculture. So where are we today? So currently, we mentioned previously, rural Mexico had the highest birth rate one of the highest birth rates in the world. And in the 1960s, labor was abundant. There were not a lot of opportunities. That's changing. So this is a figure from a paper that I wrote with Ed Taylor several years ago, where we measured the probability, the trend in the probability that people from rural Mexico work in agriculture over time. So we had household survey data, nationally representative of rural Mexico, with retrospective work histories for all members of the household, children of the household head and his or her spouse, every year from 1980 to 2010. So for 31 years, we can track where people are working, whether in Mexico or the United States, and see the change in the probability of working in agriculture. We found that the probability of working in agriculture is decreasing by about 1% per year. Scaling by the population of rural Mexico, that's about 250,000 people per year leaving agriculture. And we found that there was a statistically significant negative trend in all 5 census regions of rural Mexico. So even if we try to move further south, where people are more likely to work in agriculture, where the intersects are much higher, even there, we're seeing this similar negative trend. So what does that mean for agriculture in the United States? We think first of our labor-intensive fruits and vegetables. Are we just going to start importing those really labor-intensive crops from elsewhere, places where labor is more abundant? But how much are consumers willing to pay for domestically grown fruits and vegetables? If we believe that the quality of peaches grown in Georgia or California is better than peaches that we might import from further abroad, maybe consumers are willing to pay a little bit more for that quality. And how much are consumers willing to pay for Montana beef? You know, Montana has really marketed the quality of our beef. It might be more expensive than beef that you can buy from elsewhere, more expensive to produce. But if we have a better quality product, consumers are often willing to pay a premium for that quality. And so I think the future of agriculture, in part, will have to focus on the quality of the goods that we're producing. Other alternatives, we could try to recruit workers from further abroad. So Mexico is becoming more developed. There are more opportunities in their non-farm sector. Children are becoming more educated. They have other opportunities. So maybe we should just recruit workers from elsewhere. So if we were to go further south into Central America, well, the rural population of Central America is less than that of Mexico by about 6 million people. So if we go further south into Central America, we're still competing with Mexico and other Central American countries for a limited supply of labor. Mexico, for example, brings guest workers from Guatemala to work on their farms at the same time that they export workers to the United States. So limited capacity to bring in workers from other parts of Central America. We could recruit workers from even further abroad. Many countries in Asia and Africa haven't really begun transitioning out of farm work in the way that Mexico has. So we could bring workers from further abroad. Have to think about the costs of transporting workers from Asia or Africa. Now here in Montana, I was surprised to learn that a lot of our H2A workers actually do come from South Africa. Same in North Dakota. I thought that was really fascinating when I first arrived here and started learning about that. But those workers are typically driving combines. So if I can recruit a worker who already is skilled in using some very advanced machinery, and if I think about the marginal product of that worker, how much additional production that worker supplies, if that worker is driving a combine, the marginal product of that worker is probably pretty high. But the marginal product of a worker who's hand picking apples or strawberries, not so high. So I think there probably is opportunities. There are opportunities to bring workers from Africa or Asia if they have mechanical skills and if we can combine them with capital so that they're very productive. And we already see that happening, but I don't think that will be the full solution for having sufficient labor for agriculture in the United States. So in the meantime, one of the goals is to try to make agricultural jobs in the United States at least as attractive as agricultural jobs back home. So one of the ways that we can do that is to streamline the migration process. So H2A is an agricultural guest worker program. It is for seasonal work only. It's a very complex program. It's been around since 1986, but initially the take-up of this program was quite low. But we already mentioned how much unauthorized immigration was occurring in the 1980s. So you can imagine trying to compete with the availability of cheap labor in the 1980s would have been quite difficult. Nevertheless, in the past few years, we've seen this tremendous growth in H2A employment. So from 2001 to 2019, H2A employment grew by more than 450%. Now, I think one of the major reasons that H2A is growing is because the availability of workers locally is becoming less and less. So if I can contract a guest worker to work on my farm, they can't work elsewhere, then they're locked in for the season. I don't have to worry about finding labor at the last minute when I'm trying to harvest my crops or do something very time sensitive. In terms of the cost of using the program, I got this flow chart from the Department of Labor. I know you can't read it. It's very complex, as you can see. And I think my favorite part of this chart is that little white box at the end of the chart. It says, congratulations, Nick, you're now ready to file with the USCIS. So a lot of paperwork, very complex program. There have been efforts to streamline the H2A program. They've had little success in the past. I'm somewhat optimistic that as this program is being used more and more, maybe we will find some compromises to make this program easier for employers. while still protecting the rights of employees. There's obviously concerns for employees who may not know all of their rights and are tied to one employer. We don't want employees to become basically enslaved to a bad employer. So one of the reasons it's a complex program is to protect workers. So who qualifies for H-2A? The employer has to offer a job that is temporary or seasonal in nature. So dairies are eliminated because they need year-round work. The employer has to demonstrate that there are not enough U.S. workers able, willing, qualified, and available to do the temporary work. They have to show that employing H-2A workers will not adversely affect the wages and working conditions of similarly employed U.S. workers. Employers have to pay the adverse effect wage rate, which is set by the Department of Labor, varies by state, and generally have to submit a single valid temporary labor certification from the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, previously, there were special regulations that made it easier for livestock and herders to employ H-2A workers. They allowed guest workers to work longer hours, work 364 days of the year. These special allowances were eliminated in January of 2022. So recent changes for livestock and herders, I've came across some estimated costs of these changes in the allowances based on just learning what the new regulations are, but the actual costs in terms of changing production practices are really unknown. So given the complexity of this program, most of the growth in H-2A employment has occurred by hiring consulting agencies or lawyers to do a lot of the paperwork and recruiting on behalf of the grower. So some examples are the North Carolina Growers Association. This makes all of the growers joint employers. The H-2A workers can actually move from farm to farm. Washington Farm Labor Association is another very large one. They guarantee a labor supply. That's kind of their big sell, is this is a guaranteed labor supply. As I've talked to apple growers in Washington, many of them have told me like this was how they had to start because it was such a complex program. This is how they had to learn how to use it. They're trying to bring in some of these services in-house, but had to initially, for the first few years, use another agency to learn how to use the program. Might still use an agency to help recruit workers and really depend on that migration network. Here's a figure just showing that the growth in H-2A employment is almost entirely guest workers who were employed through an association or consultant. So these middlemen have played a very large role in H-2A growth. So here's a snapshot of H-2A employment in Montana. Montana obviously has fewer H-2A workers than some of the neighboring states like Idaho and Washington that have much more labor-intensive crops and larger populations. But 2019, pre-pandemic snapshot, some employers write down very specifically what the H-2A workers will be employed to do. Some of them do not. So like that orange sliver in there is just general farm workers. But you can see livestock is a very large share of H-2A employment in Montana, as is grains, pulses, and hay. Agricultural equipment operators, still pretty generic. But you get some idea of what H-2A workers are employed to do in Montana. So even though not nearly as many H-2A workers as you might see in other states, particularly given how rural Montana is, finding workers to do seasonal work is probably quite challenging, and the H-2A program has helped fill that gap. I mentioned that H-2A has grown probably in large part because the labor supply to agriculture has been shrinking, or at least the numbers haven't been shrinking. It's been getting tighter and more difficult to find those seasonal workers. Now, I feel like among those who talk about farm labor, this is just kind of accepted as a given fact, but there hasn't been much empirical evidence to really show if there's a causal relationship there. So this is a figure from a paper I wrote with Marcelo Castillo. We just plotted out the growth of H-2A employment along with construction employment over time. And we noticed that nationally, they followed some similar trends. So during the housing boom in the early 2000s, we saw H-2A employment rise. During the bust, H-2A employment decreased a little bit. And then we saw H-2A employment rebound again after we were coming out of the recession. And so we thought maybe there is actually a causal relationship there. Construction workers, similar to farm workers, tend to often be immigrants, might not have a lot of education. And so during a housing boom, if there's a lot of competition with other sectors of work to employ these workers, mostly immigrants, low levels of education, they might pull workers out of agriculture. And traditionally, agriculture has been seen as sort of the springboard for new immigrants as they're getting settled in a community and finding opportunities in the non-farm sector. So growth in non-farm sectors could really pull workers out of agriculture. And then as an employer, I might start using the H-2A program to find guest workers who can only work in agriculture. And sure enough, we found that a 1% increase in housing demand within commuting zones led to a 0.4 to 0.97% increase in H-2A employment from 2001 to 2017. We also found positive effects of housing booms on local farm wages, which is consistent with workers moving out of agriculture and this competition with non-farm sectors. So I think this is actually pretty interesting. I think it has a lot of interesting implications right now. We can drive around, we can see help wanted signs in restaurants and stores all over the country. And so this competition with non-farm sectors, I think, is going to become more intense, or at least is quite intense right now. So we see that H-2A is one of the mechanisms that agriculture is using to have sufficient labor. And so looking just at some trends in employment in the United States and Montana, here's a look at the unemployment rate. Obviously it spiked during the pandemic. It's come back down, pretty similar to what it was pre-pandemic. Unemployment rate can be somewhat deceptive because some people might drop out of the workforce altogether, in which case they won't be counted among the unemployed. They might just get discouraged and quit looking for jobs. So here's a look at civilian employment. It's all from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the red is the total, and then it breaks it down a little bit by industry. But overall, employment is growing similar to what it was pre-pandemic again. And we can see growth by industry. Agriculture is not included in here. Leisure and hospitality was one of the largest growths in 2022. This is going from September 2021 to September 2022. Growth was even greater in 2021 compared to 2020. Obviously, some of those sectors took a real nosedive during the pandemic and started recovering in 2021. That recovery has continued in 2022. So if we take this back a step and think about how agriculture competes with some of these other industries for a limited supply of labor, this could have important implications for agriculture. Labor force participation rate is still lagging a little bit. If you look at the scale here, it's pretty condensed from 55 to 80%. So we're still just maybe a couple percentage points less than what labor force participation rate was pre-pandemic, but there's something going on here. And I don't think I've really found enough explanations that are really convincing. I think there's still some mystery here. Why is the labor force participation rate still a little bit less than what it was pre-pandemic? And we can talk about some of those reasons, but I don't think we've figured out the full story. Interesting here, the red is the labor force participation rate total. The blue is for men and the black is for women. And interesting here, the women's labor force participation rate has followed a very similar pattern to men. So one of the explanations that maybe some people have dropped out of the labor force to care for children, lack of childcare. So dual income families might have become single income families, but we don't see that specifically women have just dropped out of the labor force. So I don't think that is a full explanation for what's going on here. Looking at Montana specifically, it looks like my graph got a little wonky there. Thought I fixed all of those. But this is running from January 2021 up until I think September 2022. So sorry about the labels down here, but once again, similar to what we're seeing nationally, major peak in unemployment during the pandemic, but recovery since then, unemployment rate in Montana is actually lower than what it was pre-pandemic. Employment in Montana is on the rise. We've also had a lot of people move into the state recently, so that probably accounts for some of the recent rise in employment. And then the labor force participation rate, also similar to what we're seeing nationally, is not what it was pre-pandemic. So what explains some of this reduction in the labor force participation rate? There could be some transitory reasons why workers dropped out of the workforce immediately following the pandemic. Some reasons might have been extended unemployment insurance benefits and tax credits. Most of these have expired, so those don't really explain why we still have a lower labor force participation rate. Government payments gave workers extra savings. They might have stayed out of the workforce a little bit longer while they looked for a job that they preferred. Most of these have been discontinued, but there are some newer policies such as loan forgiveness that might help workers save and maybe stay out of the labor force a little bit longer. Some workers might have some health concerns about returning to work. Hopefully these are temporary, but obviously we know that everyone has different risks, particularly with the current virus. So those are some of the more temporary factors. Could there be more structural adjustment going on in the labor force? We had some early retirements. So that leads to the question, are there enough younger people to take the place of those who retired during the pandemic? And among those who are replacing that older workforce, do they have the same skill sets? Are they as productive? So definitely some challenges with the early retirements. Mentioned dual income families. There's limited access to daycare. Daycare might be very expensive. So some families might have decided to reduce to single income, though we don't see specifically a different pattern for women compared to men in terms of labor force participation. And then finally, there's what many people have been terming the Great Reassessment. Many people dropped out of the workforce temporarily during the pandemic and are waiting for that perfect opportunity, that dream job, before they return. Record high quit rates in 2021. Quit rate was at a 20-year high in the November of 2021. And so particularly in food service, a lot of people voluntarily quit. To the extent that food service might compete with agriculture for workers of similar skills, there's a lot of openings in food service that might put a lot of pressure on agricultural employers to find enough workers. So to the extent that these changes are temporary, and to the extent that they might be more permanent structural changes, time will tell. A quick look at the meatpacking industry. Obviously, meatpacking was a major focus during the pandemic. According to the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis, an estimated 59,000 meatpacking workers contracted COVID-19 in 11 months from 2020 to 2021. And we were all watching this on the news and seeing these dangers that particularly people in meatpacking, workers in meatpacking, had to face. FPL Foods in Georgia said absenteeism averaged 20% at their plant in 2021. They offered a starting wage of $15, and they chose which disassembly line to actually operate each day because they didn't have enough workers to operate at full capacity. Tyson Foods was processing only about 80% capacity in 2021 due to fewer workers. And so as this labor pressure is being placed particularly on the meat processing industry, we're seeing more and more investments in mechanization. And so I think this brings a lot of questions about, I think it's starting particularly in chicken processing, where a lot of the technologies existed or were very close to being viable technologies and cost effective. What innovations will continue and produce from this as producers are having a harder and harder time finding enough workers. So then going back to agriculture, what does the future of agriculture look like? And how does technology play a role? I believe there will be many more investments in labor-saving technologies and precision agriculture, really improving the productivity of workers. Some examples include integrated weed management systems that can actually use cameras and robots to pick weeds within rows. Saves a lot of labor compared to hand weeding. There will be cultivation of new varieties. I pulled this article out several years ago just because I thought it was kind of a neat example of growers just coming up with innovative ideas. Raisin grapes used to be the most labor-intensive crop in North America. Someone would have to go through, hand-pick the grapes, lay them out on trays between the trellises to dry in the sun. Then somebody has to go up, roll up those paper trays of raisins, and then collect them at the end of the rows. More and more innovations allowed them to do this with less labor. There were dry on the vine technologies where workers had to go through and just snip the canes, and then the grapes would just sort of hang there in clusters and dry on the vine, and then they could shake them out mechanically. This grower came up with a new variety where you don't even have to go through and snip the cane. The grapes just naturally dry on the vine. I don't know that this variety, this sun cream, is actually used commercially, but I think it is a really cool example of growers coming up with innovative ideas to solve their problems with labor. Development of robotics. 10 years ago, I started presenting on farm labor, and robotics to harvest strawberries was something that people were working on, was still far in the future. Robotic strawberry harvesters became commercially available last year. So I think it'll be quite a long time before we see very many robots harvesting our strawberries, because I think they're still working it through a lot of the kinks to make them really cost effective. But we've come a long ways in 10 years, and I think that we will continue to see more advances in robotics. Apple harvesting robots. Also, there's been a lot of work in this. This is a photo of a robot that actually vacuum sucks the apples off the trees. I'm not aware that these are commercially used anywhere. They're definitely not in commercial use in the United States. I've been talking with agricultural engineers who are working on robots that would have multiple arms to pull the apples off the trees to make them fast enough. They're looking at machines that would have 9 arms just pulling those apples off the trees. Still not economically viable yet, but if workers become scarcer and scarcer, some of these technologies will become viable. Talking to apple growers in Washington, they all tell me it's not a question of whether we will be harvesting robotically, it's just a question of when. And so I'm going to leave off with just this view and questions for the future. So I really believe that the future of agriculture is going to include increased mechanization, development of robots, breeding new varieties, adopting precision agriculture. But that doesn't mean that we will eliminate the need for labor. So what kinds of skills will farms require in the future? What kind of technical, mechanical, and data analytics skills? Particularly as we think of precision agriculture, that includes a lot of data gathering. We need people who can actually organize those data and interpret those data and use them effectively and efficiently. So how do we educate and train the farm workers of tomorrow? And will the farm workers of tomorrow be children who grew up in the United States, or will we still depend on an immigrant source of labor? Will that labor source be more educated than they were in the past? And how do we prepare for that? And so leaving off with some of those questions to think about, thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take questions.
Any questions for Diane, or Diane, if you'd ask if any attendees online have questions? I don't know if I can unmute them or not, honestly.
I'm trying to figure out.
I got a question for you. How likely is it, do you think, that the H-2A program will be expanded or made easier in light of the politics in this country?
That's a hard question. I don't think any of us know. So the Farm Worker Modernization Act was passed by the House, I think in 2019. My understanding was that there was a lot of bipartisan support for that legislation. It would have allowed for some non-seasonal farm workers to be H-2A workers. So dairies would have had an opportunity to participate in the H-2A program under that act. It also provided for a pathway to citizenship. So certain aspects of that that would have appealed to different interest groups. It got stalled in the Senate, pandemic happened, and I think it's been stalled indefinitely. I don't know. I mean, I think that's the big question. My optimism is that now that more and more people are using the H-2A program, I think there's more interest in actually expanding it and making it better and more attention to this issue. But my pessimism is, as you mentioned, politics. And I think you can find people from anywhere in the political spectrum who would agree that we have a very bad situation in terms of needing unauthorized immigrants to harvest our food and not having a system for people to do that legally. I think that's a pretty non-controversial thing to say, but in terms of how we address that problem becomes very controversial and often becomes more seeking votes than actually coming up with solutions. So,
And it does seem like some of the people that I've known that came with H-2A, they switched to sectors that are paying a lot more, and they may be gone for a year putting up siding. And then when that thing's gone, so they come in under H-2A, they go illegal,
okay.
and then they never go back to the ag sector because they're making too much money.
I don't know anything about the share of H-2A who just kind of run away. So some obviously do. I don't know how large a share that is. I hear from talking with growers, mostly I've talked with growers in Washington recently. They say they have a pretty good retention rate. Growers I talked to had a pretty good retention rate of H-2A workers coming back each year. And then, they also learn who the good workers are. There's some workers who they don't invite back. I've heard that it's a different story if you go to the southeast of the United States. So I think there are some regional differences in how well H-2A has worked as well. But all good points.
Is mechanization and automation of agriculture going to get rid of the need, or like, is it going to make it only agriculture only available to people who are like higher educated and able to better understand like the data and stuff like that, or is there still going to be need for people who might not be as educated and like rely on like physical labor and stuff like that for work?
I don't think we're going to completely eliminate the need for some of that physical labor that might require less education. I've been working with some co-authors to just try to map out the feasibility of a robotic apple harvester. We're still factoring in workers who are checkers and are trying to pull out the bad apples before they take it to the packing house, because once it goes to the packing house, every apple that gets culled is a major cost to the grower. So I think there's still going to be a fair amount of manual labor on the farm, but I think the mechanization can really reduce how much manual labor is needed. But yeah, good question. I think there will be opportunities all the way around. We're just finding fewer and fewer workers who want to do manual work.
Diane, you might need to repeat the question just so that the folks online can hear. They said it's a little tough to hear, but just thinking about it specifically from ranching and even from farming, it seems like the main role where we really need humans is in that quality control. Both looking at, quality control of what is actually harvested by these automations, and then also quality control from certainly a livestock health standpoint. That's hard to monitor. In my mind, I guess, robotics. And so both sectors are needed, correct? Just an experience along with the skill to handle the data that's produced from precision ag.
So the question was about having sufficient quality control as we increased the use of robots in crop and livestock production. I agree, and I think particularly as we think of this global market for agricultural goods, I think one of the major advantages that we can really try to enhance in the United States is to show that we have good quality products. Robots could potentially help us improve the quality of products. If we can use cameras to have like that perfect color of apple, whatever it is. In the dairy industry, we're having more robots that actually milk the cows. We can collect a lot of data on cow health and just really make some of those precise decisions about how to move forward day to day. I think there will be lots of opportunities to use these technologies to improve quality, but that also requires the skills to actually analyze and understand the data. So I think you brought up some really good points there, important points.
How well is this mechanization received by farmers? Because I know a lot of multi-generation farms aren't as accepting of new ways of doing things.
I think it's particularly with this issue of labor, if you can't find enough workers, you're looking for solutions. And so generally farms that I talk to, I don't know if it's what they prefer or not, but they see that that's where the industry is headed. And if they don't go that way, they won't be able to keep their costs down. So definitely there will be steep learning curves, as with every new technology. I mentioned the robotic dairy farms, that technology has been around for decades. My understanding is only recently has that actually been commercially viable in the United States and cost saving. And it changes the way we do dairy production. So major changes, always difficult when you have sort of this heritage and culture of farming. But I think people are embracing it because they know that's how they'll stay in business.
One other question related to that, Diane, I wonder if people are looking at the trade-offs from adopting technology to the complications of managing human workers. I mean, we're complex individuals and we take a lot of time to resolve issues and to hire and fire and evaluate and all of the things that go along with keeping that human workforce productive and satisfied.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely, so in terms of the complexity of managing a human workforce, I go back to an example of my brother-in-law's farm in Central Valley of California. They had a diversified family farm for decades. They're pulling out the fruit trees and putting in almonds and citrus that can be mechanically harvested because they don't want to depend on a workforce. Part of that is the cost of workers and the difficulty of finding workers, but it is also the difficulty of managing workers. Their workforce is getting older. Somebody falls off a ladder. You have all kinds of risks. So there definitely are some advantages to taking a more mechanical route, and some people are embracing that for those reasons.
Any other questions or not?
Yeah, I have a question. And so that lawsuit that you mentioned from California was interesting. Do you know, like, is there still a legal precedent for something like that where if the new technology comes about? Because it seems like most technologies can have, you know, winners and losers in some sense. Is there still some legal precedent for that kind of?
That's a good question.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so the question is, with the lawsuit for the mechanical tomato harvester, in which University of California lost the lawsuit because there were some losers. They used government dollars to create a technology that was unfairly disadvantaged small growers and workers. Has there been any legal precedent since then? To my knowledge, there isn't any precedent that has followed. And sort of the message that I've been proposing as I've looked more into these changes in farm labor availability is that this is just a different world than it was in the 1960s and the 1970s. We don't have abundant supply of labor. So it's not going to displace workers if workers don't want to do the job.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of, there was a lot of conversation back in the 1970s. We don't know. I mean, we can figure out how many workers were displaced from tomato fields, but we also know that we created jobs in tomato canning and processing. So we don't know exactly what the cost was in terms of lost jobs, because jobs were also created. What's the cost of moving from the fields to processing? So there's always a lot of unknowns when we try to quantify that. So I think that's, to my understanding, I think that's the message moving forward is we're really in a place where we don't have an option anymore. But in terms of a legal precedent, I don't know what has happened legally. Good question.
Well, thanks, Diane. I don't see anything coming through on the chat, so I appreciate it a lot. And
Thank you.
tell everybody online thanks, and we'll sign off.
Did someone just raise a hand?
Said Darren.
Oh, is it Darren?
Oh, it's Darren, mute. Mute.
If you can unmute him, I'm not sure. I can't see.
Not up.
See you later.
Good talk, thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting. See you soon, Bob.
Oh, Darren said you just hit the wrong button. Okay,
Occupied, sorry.
so we'll just close the meeting.
I still haven't figured out all the ins and outs of Zoom.
Yeah, and this one,
I mean, even like large tractors, you could